On a cold, rainy afternoon in Seattle, billionaire William Hartman sat in his grand library pretending to sleep. A thick envelope stuffed with $5,000 lay open on the table beside him, bait for a loyalty test he had set for his new maid. But the one who would change his life that day wasn't the maid at all, it was her 8-year-old daughter, Lily Miller. The rain had been falling over Seattle for hours, a steady, cold drizzle that turned the city's streets into mirrors of light. In the middle of that storm, high above the wet pavement and foggy skyline, stood the Hartman estate, a sprawling mansion of stone and glass that overlooked Lake Washington. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The fireplace in the grand library flickered, casting amber shadows across rows of books that had not been touched in years. Seated in a large leather armchair by the fire was William Hartman, 76 years old, worth nearly $8 billion, and yet more burdened than any man in the room. To the world outside, he was a legend, the man who built a tech empire from nothing, who turned code and courage into one of America's most powerful corporations. But to those who knew him, or thought they did, William had become something else entirely, a ghost of success, a man consumed by suspicion and loneliness. The years had not been kind to him. His body was frail, his hair thin and silver, and the skin on his hands, once strong enough to hold entire companies together, now trembled even when he held a glass of water. But the sharpness in his eyes, hidden beneath half-closed lids, was still there. William Hartman didn't rest much these days. He only pretended to see what people would do when they thought he wasn't watching. Trust had become a foreign word in William's vocabulary. Decades of betrayal had burned it out of him completely. His ex-wife had left him for a younger man the same year. His eldest son tried to force him into early retirement. His daughter only called when she needed money. And his youngest son had gambled away the fortune William had once given him to start a business. Every relationship in his life had been reduced to a transaction, every expression of love shadowed by greed. Even his employees, the housekeepers and gardeners who worked in his mansion, had stolen from him a missing bottle of wine here, a piece of silverware there, small things that confirmed what he already believed. Everyone took what they could when no one was watching. Over the years, this belief hardened in him like stone, until it became the foundation of his personality. He wasn't just wealthy, he was guarded, isolated, and bitter. That afternoon, as the storm beat against the tall windows, William decided to conduct another of his experiments. It wasn't the first time. He liked to think of them as social tests, small psychological games designed to prove, once again, that human goodness was an illusion. His method was simple: leave temptation within reach, appear unaware, and wait. Every time, the outcome had been the same: disappointment. People always failed. It was as if the entire world had conspired to prove him right. But even so, William couldn't stop. Some part of him wanted to be wrong. Some small, fragile corner of his soul, buried beneath decades of distrust, still hoped that one day someone might surprise him. He adjusted the folds of the plaid blanket over his knees and glanced at the mahogany table beside him. On it lay a thick, unsealed envelope. Inside, a stack of crisp $100 bills gleamed faintly in the firelight. $5,000. The envelope was positioned carelessly, as if forgotten by an old man too tired to care. He could already imagine how it would play out. True, the maid would enter, notice the money, glance around, and hesitate. Then she would take a step closer, perhaps telling herself she only wanted to make sure it was safe. Finally, her hand would reach out, trembling with greed or fear, and that would be the moment he would open his eyes, catch her, and dismiss her immediately. The thought almost made him smile. Her name was Grace Miller. She had started working at the mansion 3 weeks earlier. William had looked over her file carefully. Age 32, widowed, a mother of one. Her husband, a construction worker, had died in an accident 2 years ago, leaving her with nothing but debt and a little girl named Lily. Grace had no college degree, no family nearby, and no savings. On paper, she was exactly the type of person who would take the money, not out of malice, but out of desperation. And desperation, William believed, was the truest measure of human nature. Everyone has a breaking point, he once told his lawyer. You just have to find the right price. As he sat there, listening to the distant rumble of thunder, William thought about how different things used to be. In his youth, he had believed in people, partners, friends, employees. Back then, he would have given anything for loyalty and camaraderie. But success had a strange way of distorting everything it touched. The more he gained, the more others wanted from him, until all that remained was a circle of smiling faces waiting for his signature on a check. It was exhausting, so years ago he stopped trying. He fired half his staff, installed cameras in every hallway, and spoke to almost no one unless it was necessary. He told himself it was better this way: safe, controlled, predictable. Yet as he sat there now, pretending to sleep by the fire, the mansion felt unbearably large. filled with the kind of emptiness that money couldn't fill. Outside the library door, he could hear faint footsteps echoing across the marble hallway, the careful, deliberate pace of someone trying not to disturb him. That would be Grace, punctual as always, coming to dust the bookshelves and polish the glass cases. She had asked earlier that morning for permission to bring her daughter with her, since the schools had closed due to the storm. William had agreed reluctantly, though he made it clear the child was not to be seen or heard while she was in the house. He didn't dislike children, he simply didn't know what to do with them. The few times he had tried to bond with his own grandchildren, they had been more interested in their tablets than in the man who could buy them 100 of them. The doorknob turned softly, and William slowed his breathing, lowering his chin slightly so his head rested deeper into the armchair. His eyes stayed shut, but his mind was alert, calculating every sound, every movement. The heavy door creaked open, letting in a faint draft of cold air that carried the scent of rain and wet grass. He heard Grace's voice, quiet, careful, carrying the fatigue of someone who had learned to live with worry. "Stay right here, honey," she whispered. "Sit on the rug and don't move, okay? Mr. Hartman is sleeping. If you wake him, Mommy could lose her job." A small, higher voice replied, soft and earnest, "Okay, Mommy." William felt an unexpected sting in his chest at that tone. It wasn't defiance or curiosity. It was fear, the kind that only a child who's seen too much responsibility too young could have. He waited for the sound of Grace's footsteps leaving, the faint click of the door closing. Now there were only two people left in the room, an old billionaire pretending to dream, and a little girl he had never met, who was told to stay out of trouble. He imagined what she must look like, thin, maybe a little pale, wearing cheap shoes that let the rain in. He wondered if she would notice the money. Children were naturally curious, and poor children, he thought bitterly, were even more so. He was sure she would fidget, wander around, maybe even touch the envelope just to feel what wealth looked like. It would be proof enough. He adjusted his breathing again, slow and steady, waiting. But as the minutes passed, nothing happened. He heard the crackle of the fire, the ticking of the grandfather clock near the corner, and the faint rhythm of rain against the windows. Still no movement. It began to unsettle him. He wasn't used to people resisting temptation. Usually by now the trap had sprung. He almost opened his eyes out of curiosity, but he didn't. Not yet. He wanted to see how long she would last. Then he heard it, the faintest rustle of fabric, the sound of a small person standing up. His pulse quickened. Here it comes, he thought. The moment of truth. He felt her tiny footsteps approaching, soft against the carpet. The air shifted slightly as she drew near. William kept his breathing even, his heart thudding behind his ribs. The envelope was right there, within reach of a child's hand. $5,000, carelessly waiting to be taken. And in that moment, with his eyes still closed, William Hartman, a man who had spent a lifetime proving that no one could be trusted, had no idea that he was about to meet the only person who would ever prove him wrong. Grace Miller stood just outside the library door, taking a slow breath before stepping inside. The sound of the rain outside felt like an endless drumbeat on the mansion's tall windows. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing and washing, her shoes worn to the thread, and her black uniform clung damply to her from the storm. She glanced down at her daughter, Lily, who stood beside her holding a small pink backpack shaped like a cat. The little girl's hair was still damp, and her sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished marble floor. Grace had tried to dry her off with a towel in the kitchen, but the storm had soaked them both through before they reached the house. "Remember what I said, baby," Grace whispered, kneeling down to her daughter's level. "You stay on the rug, okay? No walking around, no touching anything. Mr. Hartman is very tired, and we don't want to bother him." Lily nodded seriously, clutching the straps of her backpack. She had big brown eyes, wide, cautious, the kind that seemed to see more than a child should. Grace brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and gave her a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'll be fine. Mommy just needs to finish her work." Grace opened the heavy library door. It creaked softly as she pushed it, revealing the enormous room inside, floor to ceiling shelves lined with books. A crackling fireplace casting long shadows, and at the center, William Hartman reclined in his armchair with his head slightly tilted as if asleep. The sight of him always made Grace tense. Even in sleep, he looked powerful, untouchable, like the portraits of old kings she'd once seen in a museum. She whispered again to Lily, "That's him, Mr. Hartman. Don't wake him up, sweetie." Lily's eyes flicked to the man in the chair. To her, he didn't look scary, just old and tired. His face was pale, his lips thin, his hands resting loosely on his lap. She wondered if he dreamed about anything, or if rich people were too busy to dream. Grace motioned toward a small rug by the corner of the fireplace. "Sit there," she said softly. "You can color in your book, but be very quiet. I'll be back soon." Lily sat down cross-legged, pulling out a tiny notebook and a dull pencil from her bag. Grace hesitated for a moment, glancing at the billionaire one last time before walking toward the door that led to the dining room. She had polished those same floors 100 times before, but today felt different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was because she'd never had to bring Lily to work. She worried about what would happen if Mr. Hartman woke up and found the child there. She needed this job badly. It paid just enough to keep a small apartment in Rainier Valley and to buy groceries that didn't come from the clearance bin. If she lost it, there was nowhere else to go. She left the room, closing the door behind her with a gentle click. Inside, Lily looked around the grand library, her eyes wide with awe. She had never seen a room like this, books everywhere, paintings on the walls, a giant window looking out onto the gray lake. The fire crackled, throwing waves of warmth across her face. She watched the old man in the chair, his chest rising and falling, his hands still. He reminded her a little of her grandpa. Though Grandpa didn't live with them anymore, not since he went to the hospital last winter and never came back. Lily drew something in her notebook, a small cat wearing a raincoat. Her pencil scratched softly across the paper. After a few minutes, she looked up again. The old man hadn't moved. The fire burned lower, and she noticed that the wind from the window was blowing toward him. His thin blanket didn't cover his knees fully, and the air in the room was cool enough to make her fingers tingle. She frowned. Her mom always said that old people get cold faster. She thought about the warm jacket she was wearing, pink, with a missing zipper pull, the one her mom had bought secondhand last month. It was still a little damp, but it was warmer than nothing. Lily stood up quietly and walked toward the armchair. She moved carefully, like she did when sneaking cookies from the kitchen back home. Her small shoes made almost no sound on the thick rug. She stopped beside Mr. Hartman's chair and looked at him. He didn't move, didn't open his eyes. She studied his face, noticing the faint wrinkles that crossed his forehead and the deep lines around his mouth. He looked cold, his hands slightly blue at the fingertips. She took a breath, then unzipped her jacket and slipped it off. The air touched her arms, cool and crisp. She gently laid the jacket across his knees, smoothing it over so it wouldn't slide off. The pink color looked strange against the dark leather of his chair and the rich wool of his suit, but she didn't care. She smiled a little to herself, proud of her idea. That's better, she whispered softly. Mommy says you shouldn't stay cold. She turned to walk back to her spot. But then she noticed something else, an envelope sitting near the edge of the table beside the man's chair. It looked heavy, a little bent, like it was about to fall. Lily stepped closer, curious. She couldn't read the words written on it, but she could see green paper sticking out. Money. She knew what it was, though she had never seen that much at once. Her mother sometimes had a few wrinkled bills in her purse, but never like this thick and crisp, the kind she'd seen on the TV when people won game shows. She thought about picking it up, just to look, but then she remembered her mother's voicey, "Don't touch anything." So instead, she reached out and carefully nudged the envelope back toward the middle of the table so it wouldn't fall. She also noticed a small notebook lying on the floor near the man's foot. She bent down, picked it up, brushed off the dust, and placed it neatly beside the envelope. Then she returned to her rug, sat down, and wrapped her arms around herself. Without her jacket, she could feel the chill more now, but she didn't mind. The man looked warm, and that was enough. Meanwhile, down the hallway, Grace was working quickly, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she wiped the long dining table and polished the silver cutlery. She kept glancing toward the closed library door, her heart anxious. Every clap of thunder made her flinch. She wanted to finish her tasks and return to check on Lily, but she knew if she rushed, Mrs. Blake, the head housekeeper, would scold her again for careless work. Grace had been scolded enough lately. She couldn't afford one more mistake. Back in the library, William Hartman, still pretending to be asleep, had felt every movement, the light touch of small fingers. The weight of the jacket laid over his knees, the faint sound of the envelope sliding across the table. Inside, something in him stirred, at first suspicion. He thought she was taking the money. He braced himself to open his eyes, ready to expose her. But then he felt the warmth of the jacket, smelled the faint scent of detergent and rainwater, and realized what she had done. A child had given him her coat. Not for reward, not for approval, but because she thought he was cold. The old man's chest tightened. For years, he had believed kindness was just another form of manipulation. Yet here was a little girl, poor, shivering, probably hungry, giving up the only warm thing she had. He wanted to move, to say something, but he stayed still. He didn't know how to react. He didn't even know how to feel. So he did the only thing he could. He kept pretending to sleep, even as his heart, long hardened by wealth and years of betrayal, began to ache in a way he hadn't felt in decades. Grace finished her work and began walking back toward the library, unaware that the world inside that room had just shifted. Her footsteps echoed softly through the hall, and as she reached for the doorknob, she thought she heard her daughter humming faintly. She smiled, relieved. Lily was being good, just as she promised. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, her little girl's small act of care would change not only her own life, but the life of the most powerful man in Seattle forever. William Hartman had spent his life reading people, business partners, lawyers, politicians, every glance, every twitch of hesitation. He could sense dishonesty the way a bloodhound sensed scent. But as he sat there in the dim glow of the fire, feigning sleep, what he felt now was something he couldn't categorize. It wasn't deceit, it wasn't greed, it was something else entirely. The soft weight of the child's jacket still rested on his knees, its faint warmth seeping into his bones like an unexpected kindness. The fabric was cheap, the kind you'd find at a thrift store, still smelling faintly of rain and detergent. But to him, at that moment, it felt like the most valuable thing he'd ever been given. His breathing stayed steady, his eyes still closed, though every fiber of him wanted to open them. He wanted to see her face, to study her expression, to understand why she'd done it. But he didn't. Instead, he listened. He heard the faint shuffle of her steps as she moved away, the small rustle of her clothes as she sat down again. He pictured her huddled on that rug, probably cold without her jacket, and his throat tightened. Something about that image, a child giving warmth to a man who had more than enough, struck him deeply. He'd built skyscrapers, funded satellites, and bought entire companies just to prove he could, but in all those achievements, not once had he felt what he felt now. Something tender, fragile, uncomfortable. William's mind, sharp as ever despite age, began to wander through his memories. He thought of his own children when they were small, the days when they still hugged him after work, before money came between them. His daughter used to leave drawings on his desks, stick figures of her and her daddy hand in hand. He'd kept them for a while, until one day he threw them out, thinking he was too busy for childish things. Now he wished he hadn't. He wondered what had happened to those small, pure gestures in his world. When had everything become about profit and power? A drop of rain hit the window pane and the sound snapped him back. He realized he was gripping the armrest too tightly. He relaxed his hand, forcing himself to stay still. Across the room, he could sense movement again. The girl was stirring. He heard her small feet on the rug, and his heart picked up speed. He thought perhaps now she would take the bait. Maybe the kindness had been a distraction, a clever one. If so, he told himself not to be fooled. People could fake innocence as easily as they faked respect. He'd seen it all before. The footsteps drew nearer. He could almost feel her presence beside him. Her breathing was soft and uneven, the kind of nervous rhythm that comes with uncertainty. William held his own breath, waiting. He imagined her eyes fixed on the envelope of cash, the way so many had looked at his wealth, hungry, desperate, tempted. He pictured her small hand reaching for it. He was ready to catch her in the act, to prove his theory once again. But the rustle of paper never came. Instead, he felt a light touch on his arm, so soft it barely registered. Tiny fingers, cold from the air, brushed his sleeve, testing, almost curious. For a man who had lived through corporate battles, courtroom wars, and family betrayals, that touch was disarming. It wasn't the touch of someone trying to take it, it was the touch of someone making sure he was still there. He wanted to flinch, to open his eyes and demand what she was doing, but he didn't. He stayed still, letting her think he was asleep. The touch left his arm, and a small sigh followed, the sound of concern, not mischief. "Mr. Hartman," came a whisper so faint it nearly blended with the rain. The name sounded strange in a child's mouth, soft and hesitant. He didn't respond, he kept up the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then came a short pause, followed by another sound, a zipper. William's mind jumped to conclusions instantly. She's taking something, he thought. Maybe she brought a bag, maybe she's hiding the envelope. He almost opened his eyes. But before he could, he felt the shift of weight again. The girl had moved closer. Then warmth, the chick. She was adjusting it, tucking it more securely over his knees. He couldn't help but notice the contrast between the damp fabric and the heat from the fire. The little girl's hands were trembling as she did it, probably from the cold, but her movements were careful, almost protective. She wasn't stealing, she was helping. "You recold," she whispered, barely audible. "Mommy says sick people shouldn't stay cold." William's chest tightened. He had to fight to keep his face still. Those words pierced him deeper than any argument or accusation ever had. He'd heard people tell him he was wrong, cruel, arrogant, but never had anyone said something so small that carried so much weight. He wanted to tell her he wasn't sick, that he didn't need her pity. Yet deep down he knew she wasn't wrong. He was sick not in the way doctors measured, but in the way hearts decay from too much greed and too little love. He waited, trying to compose himself, but she wasn't done. He heard the soft scrape of the wooden table as something slid across it. Instantly suspicion returned the envelope. This time she must be taking it. His body tensed. He opened one eye slightly, the barest crack hidden behind his lashes. The firelight blurred his vision at first, but then it cleared and what he saw froze him. The girl was not stealing. She was pushing the envelope back toward the middle of the table, her small hands steady and careful. She wasn't even looking at the money. She was just making sure it didn't fall to the floor. Then, she bent down to pick up his notebook, the one that had slipped earlier, without him noticing, brushed the dust from its cover with her sleeve, and set it neatly beside the envelope. Safe now, she murmured more to herself than to him. William's heart stopped for a moment. Safe now, the words echoed in his mind like a memory from another life. When was the last time someone had cared enough to make sure he was safe? He couldn't remember. The girl stepped back to her rug, sat down, and wrapped her arms around herself. The jacketless child shivered slightly, her breath visible in the faint chill. She rested her chin on her knees and stared into the fire, lost in her own world. William watched through the thin crack of his eyelid, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades: shame. Not for her poverty, but for his own poverty of spirit. He, the man who owned skyscrapers, had just been outclassed in humanity by a child with nothing. Minutes passed, the fire crackled softly, and William's thoughts twisted in on themselves. He thought about the $5,000, how meaningless it suddenly seemed. He thought about the hundreds of employees he'd fired without a second thought, the family he'd pushed away, the walls he'd built around himself. All for what? To sit here in a mansion so empty that the kindness of a stranger's child could feel like a miracle. He wanted to say something to thank her, to give her something in return, but he couldn't. His throat wouldn't let him, so he sat there, pretending stillness, feeling the weight of her small jacket as if it were the heaviest thing he'd ever carried. For the first time in years, the great William Hartman didn't know what to think. The man who prided himself on control, who measured life in ledgers and balance sheets, was lost in a feeling he couldn't quantify. He realized that he'd set a trap expecting to catch greed, and instead he'd found grace. Somewhere deep inside, something cracked, not loudly, but with the quiet certainty of a dam giving way. And though he didn't know it yet, that small crack would soon flood the life he'd built, washing away the bitterness he'd mistaken for strength. As he listened to the faint breathing of the little girl across the room, William Hartman, for the first time in decades, didn't feel like the richest man in Seattle. He felt like a man being given a second chance, and the teacher of that lesson was 8 years old, barefoot, and shivering by his fire. Grace Miller hurried down the hallway, her footsteps quick and nervous against the marble floor. She had finished polishing the dining table and dusting the glass cabinets in record time, but her mind had been in the library the entire time. Every minute that passed made her stomach twist tighter. She worried about Lily. Her daughter was a sweet, careful child, but still a child, curious, restless, easily distracted. Grace prayed she'd stayed seated just as she'd promised. Mr. Hartman's reputation terrified her. The other maids spoke of him in hushed tones, calling him the Watcher, because he always seemed to know when someone made a mistake. One girl had been fired last year for accidentally spilling tea on a rug, another for dropping a plate. Grace couldn't afford to be the next name on that list. As she reached the library door, she paused to catch her breath, smoothing her hair and fixing the collar of her uniform. The sound of the storm outside was steady, like a warning she couldn't ignore. She turned the handle and pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. What she saw made her heart stop. Lily was standing near Mr. Hartman's chair. Her little pink jacket, the only warm thing she owned, was draped across the old man's knees. On the table beside him sat a thick envelope, the corner of it glinting faintly in the firelight. Grace's mind raced. She didn't see the kindness, only the disaster it could become. In a flash of panic, she imagined the worst: true miss. Hartman waking up, seeing the child near his money, assuming theft. The thought sent a chill straight through her. Lee. She hissed under her breath as she rushed forward, her shoes slipping slightly on the rug. Her daughter spun around, startled, her eyes wide. Mommy, what'd you do? Grace grabbed Lily gently but firmly by the shoulders, pulling her back a few steps. Why is your jacket on him? Did you touch him? Did you touch that money? Her voice shook with fear. Lily's lips trembled, her small hands clutching at the fabric of her mother's uniform. No, Mommy, she whispered. He looked cold, so I gave him my jacket, and the paper was falling, so I fixed it. Grace felt her knees weaken. Oh God, she muttered, running a shaking hand over her face. Lily, no, you can't. She glanced at Mir. Hartman, who still appeared to be sleeping. He'll wake up, she whispered desperately. He'll think we were stealing. We'll lose everything. Her voice broke at the end. She turned back to her daughter, crouching low, trying to steady herself. Honey, you don't understand. People like him, they don't forgive mistakes. They don't give second chances. She stood again and hurried toward the chair, reaching to pull the jacket away from his lap. Her hands trembled so much that she nearly knocked over the lamp. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered to the unmoving man. "I'm so sorry, she didn't mean any harm." Her heart pounded so loudly she could feel it in her throat. The jacket slipped from her fingers and fell onto the floor, and she bent to grab it, muttering apologies between quick, shallow breaths. Behind her, Lily's eyes filled with tears. She didn't understand why her mother was so scared. All she had done was help. The old man had looked cold and she had tried to be kind. But now her mother's hands were shaking, her face pale, her voice trembling like she was standing at the edge of something terrible. Lily wanted to tell her it was okay, that Mr. Hartman hadn't even moved. But the look on her mother's face told her it wasn't okay, not at all. William Hartman felt every second of it. He'd heard the rush of footsteps, the panic in the mother's voice, the raw fear of losing everything. He hadn't moved yet, but the tension in the room pressed against him like weight. He felt the jacket being pulled away from his legs, the hurried apology whispered into the air, and the sharp pain of guilt hit him unexpectedly. The woman wasn't afraid because she'd done wrong, she was afraid because of him. He hadn't realized until that moment what he had become. To this family, to everyone around him, he wasn't a man anymore. He was a threat, a symbol of power that could destroy lives with a single decision. The thought sickened him. Grace clutched the jacket to her chest and turned toward the door, gripping Lily's hand tightly. "We were leaving," she whispered urgently, "now." She pulled the girl toward the exit, her eyes darting back to the chair one last time, hoping the old man would stay asleep. But fate, it seemed, had different plans. William let out a low groan, part deliberate, part genuine. It startled both of them. Grace froze in place, her back straightening, her breath catching mid-step. Lily squeezed her hand tighter. Slowly the old man shifted in his chair, his head lifting just enough to reveal his face. His eyes blinked open, adjusting to the firelight. For a moment, the room felt suspended, the crackling fire, the steady rain outside, and the two figures standing near the door like statues. "What?" William rasped, his voice rough and deep. "Is all this noise?" He blinked a few times, feigning confusion, and frowned. "Can't a man rest in his own house without being trampled over?" Gracie's throat went dry. "I am so sorry, Mr. Hartman," she stammered, her voice barely holding together. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I was just cleaning. This is my daughter, Lily. The schools are closed today because of the storm. I had no choice but to bring her. We were just leaving, sir. Please don't fire me. I will take her outside. It won't happen again." William stared at them for a long moment, saying nothing. His eyes moved from Grace's trembling hands to the jacket she clutched, then to the small child half hidden behind her legs. He could see the fear in both of them, raw, unfiltered, real. It wasn't the fear of guilt, it was the fear of power. And he hated that he was the reason for it. He leaned forward slightly, resting his cane against the floor. "Come here," he said suddenly. His voice wasn't loud, but it had weight. Grace's heart skipped. "Sir," she didn't. "I said come here," he repeated, firmer this time. His gaze stayed fixed on Lily. The little girl hesitated, then looked up at her mother. Grace nodded shakily, urging her forward. Lily took a few cautious steps, stopping just short of the armchair. William's expression was unreadable. He tapped the envelope of money lightly against his palm, watching her reaction. "Did you put your jacket on me?" he asked. Lily swallowed and nodded. "Yes, sir." "Why?" His tone was sharp, almost accusing. "I'm a stranger. I'm rich. I have more coats than you can count." "Why give me yours?" Lily glanced down at her sneakers, then up at him. "Because you looked cold," she said softly. "And Mommy says if someone's cold, you help them. Cold is cold." The words hit William like a hammer. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, this tiny girl with messy hair and a trembling voice, explaining kindness as if it were the simplest law in the world. He looked at Grace, who was holding her breath, terrified of what he might say next. He looked back at the envelope, still heavy with cash. The test he had set that morning suddenly felt shameful. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of years lift off his chest just a little. "Cold is cold," he murmured under his breath. The room seemed to shrink around them. The fire crackled lower. The rain softened outside, and for the first time in a very long while, William Hartman didn't feel angry or alone. He felt human. Grace didn't understand what was happening. She only knew that something in the old man's face had changed. The sternness faded, replaced by a look she couldn't define, part sadness, part wonder. She braced herself for him to shout, to fire her, to send them out into the storm. But instead, he leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Don't leave just yet." Grace blinked, confused. "Sir." William nodded toward the chair opposite him. "Sit, both of you." And though fear still hung thick in the air, there was something else now, something almost fragile, like the first hint of warmth after a long winter. Grace hesitated, then slowly led her daughter toward the fire. The game William Hartman had started was over, but what came next he didn't yet know would be the real test. Grace hesitated by the armchair, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Myth. Hartman's tone was no longer sharp, yet it carried an authority that left no room for argument. Sit, he said again, gesturing toward the small couch near the fire. Grace obeyed, still clutching her daughter's hand. She lowered herself carefully onto the edge of the seat, as if afraid to crease the fabric. Lily climbed beside her, her small fingers tangled nervously with her mother's. The room smelled of cedar and smoke, and the rain outside drummed against the windows like a soft heartbeat. The warmth of the fire did little to melt the anxiety sitting heavy between them. William Hartman studied the pair closely. He had spent decades dissecting people in boardrooms, watching the twitch of an eyebrow, the flicker of a smirk, the tone behind a yes. Yet what sat before him now was different. Grace's posture was stiff with worry, her eyes red from tears she'd fought to hide. Lily, though small, sat upright beside her, not defiant but brave. There was honesty in her face that unnerved him. He leaned back, gripping the handle of his cane, and cleared his throat. You both understand, he began slowly, that this chair you see here, he gestured toward the burgundy velvet upholstery beneath him, is not just any chair. It's imported Italian velvet, $200 a yard, custom made. His voice had turned cold again, deliberate, the same tone he used in business meetings when he wanted to make people sweat. Grace blinked, uncertain where this was going. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I'll make sure to clean it properly. Clean it? He interrupted, raising a brow. You think that's all it takes? He pointed to the damp spot where Lily's jacket had rested. The faint moisture had darkened the velvet slightly. That's water. And water stains velvet. Do you know what that means? Grace's mouth went dry. I can have it treated, sir. I'll pay for it to be restored. William's eyes narrowed. Restored, that will cost at least $500. He paused deliberately, letting the number sink in. Unless, of course, you happen to have that kind of money lying around. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face. I don't, she admitted, her voice cracking. But please, Mr. Hartman, I'll work it off. Take it from my wages, whatever it takes. Just please don't be angry with her. She squeezed Lily's hand as if to shield her from whatever was coming next. William leaned forward slightly, pretending to inspect the spot again. Work it offered, tapping his cane against the floor. Interesting proposal. But I'm not sure I can trust someone careless enough to let her child damage a $2,000 chair. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Please, sir. I didn't mean. She didn't mean. William held up a hand, silencing her. Let's ask the one responsible, shall we? His gaze shifted to Lily. Young lady, he said, his tone deliberate and heavy, you caused this damage. What do you have to say for yourself? Lily froze. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her lips parting, but no words came out at first. Her mother started to speak for her, but William stopped her with a sharp look. No, I want to hear from her. Lily's voice came out small but steady. I didn't mean to hurt your chair, she said. I just wanted to help. You looked cold. Cold, he repeated, almost mocking. And that makes it acceptable to ruin expensive furniture. Lily's chin wobbled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her jeans, her little hand trembling. I don't have $500, she said softly, but I can give you this. Grace looked down in confusion as Lily pulled her hand from her pocket and slowly opened her palm. Lying there was a tiny, battered toy, a small porcelain ballerina, the kind that once twirled inside a jewelry box. One arm was missing, and the paint had chipped from years of being held and hugged and carried. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Lily, no, she whispered, that's from your dad. Lily shook her head gently, still holding the toy out toward the old man. It's okay, Mommy, she said with quiet resolve. Meh. Hartman's mad, and I don't want him to be mad at you. Daddy always said if you break something, you try to fix it or give something that matters most to you. This matters to me. William stared at the small object resting in her palm. The ballerina was no bigger than his thumb, chipped and faded, worthless by any reasonable measure. Yet the way the child offered it, with sincerity and sadness and courage, made it priceless. His throat tightened as he took in the scene, the trembling hand of a girl who had nothing, offering the last piece of her father to make peace with a man who had everything. For a moment he couldn't speak. His test suddenly felt monstrous. He'd pushed too far, crossed from cynicism into cruelty. What had started as an experiment to confirm human greed had turned into something entirely different, a mirror reflecting his own emptiness. Grace reached out, trying to pull Lily's hand back. Honey, you don't have to do that, she said, her voice breaking. But Lily stepped forward, determined. She placed the tiny ballerina on the table beside the damp spot on the chair. Here, she said softly. Now we even. William stared at the toy as if it were a sacred relic. He couldn't look away. His cane slipped slightly as he leaned forward, both hands trembling. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the deep lines carved by years of bitterness. The room felt different now, warmer, heavier. The air itself seemed to demand that he finally see the truth. He picked up the toy gently, holding it in his palm. It felt light, fragile, absurdly small for something that suddenly carried so much weight. His voice, when it came, was no longer the voice of a man testing others. It was the voice of someone realizing how wrong he'd been. "You," he said quietly, "would give me this, for a wet chair." Lily nodded. "Is it enough?" William closed his eyes for a moment, his lips pressing together to keep them from trembling. He thought of his own children, grown adults now, strangers who visited only when they wanted money. None of them had ever given him anything without expecting more in return, not one. When he opened his eyes again, they glistened with something unfamiliar. "Yes," he whispered, "it's more than enough." Grace looked up, startled by the sudden gentleness in his tone. "Mr. Hartman?" she asked cautiously. He turned to her slowly, still holding the ballerina. "Mrs. Miller," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "You've raised a remarkable child." He glanced at Lily again. "She's richer than I'll ever be." Grace blinked, unsure how to respond. She had never seen the old man look so human. His sharp, cold features seemed softer now. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of years had finally caught up to him. William placed the ballerina on the edge of the table, staring at it for a long time before speaking again. "The chair," he said quietly, "is fine. It'll dry. You don't owe me a cent." Grace exhaled, her body sagging with relief. She nodded quickly, wiping at the tears that had begun to fall. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. But William wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "I wasn't asleep earlier," he said suddenly. "I was pretending." Grace froze. "Pretending?" He nodded slowly. "That envelope on the table, it was a test. I wanted to see if you'd take it. I thought everyone would." His voice carried a hint of shame now. "But your daughter, she didn't take a thing, she gave." Grace said nothing. She just held Lily closer, her heart breaking and healing all at once. William looked down at the ballerina once more, then back at the mother and child sitting before him. "I think it's time I stop testing people," he said softly, "and start trusting them again." The firelight flickered across the room, and in that moment, it wasn't the mansion or the money that made William Hartman feel wealthy again. It was the presence of a small girl with a chipped toy, who had reminded him that generosity still existed, even in a world that had taught him to doubt it. For a long moment, no one moved. The crackle of the fire filled the vast library, throwing gold light across the old man's face. William Hartman sat still, the small porcelain ballerina resting in his hand. His thumb brushed over the chip paint, tracing the tiny missing arm. The fragile toy, broken yet loved, seemed to hold more truth than the wealth he'd built his entire empire on. Grace sat frozen on the couch, uncertain whether to apologize again or thank him or simply leave before he changed his mind. Lily, small and shivering in her thin sweater, watched him with quiet curiosity, unaware she had just changed the life of one of the most powerful men in the city. William cleared his throat and set the ballerina gently on the table beside the envelope of cash. "The chair is fine," he said again, his tone softer now, almost wary. "No one's losing their job today." Grace let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She nodded quickly, whispering, "Thank you, sir." Her hand squeezed Lily's shoulder as if to steady herself. But William wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his cane balanced against the arm of the chair. "I need to be honest with you," he said, and for once his voice wasn't commanding, it was human, tired. "Everything you saw today, the envelope, the money, me pretending to sleep, it was all a test, a foolish one perhaps." Grace's eyes widened. "A test," she repeated, barely believing what she was hearing. He nodded. "I wanted to see if you'd take the money. I've done it before with others. I suppose I wanted to prove myself right again." Grace swallowed, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to be angry, to tell him how cruel it was to toy with people who had nothing. But another part saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders had slumped. This wasn't arrogance anymore, it was guilt. William looked down at his hands, speaking more to the fire than to them. "I've lived too long believing that everyone has a price, that kindness doesn't exist unless it's bought. And I was wrong, your daughter showed me that." He lifted his gaze to Lily, and for the first time, he smiled, not the polite smile of a businessman or the smug grin of a man with power, but something small and real. "You young lady," he said gently, "gave me something no one has in a very long time." He pointed toward the ballerina. "That. You didn't even hesitate to give it away. You don't know it, but you've taught me more today than I've learned in 76 years. Lily tilted her head slightly. "I did?" she asked, confused. William chuckled softly. "You did," he said. "You reminded me that not everyone takes, some people give, some people care." Grace felt tears prick her eyes again, though this time they weren't from fear. She looked at her daughter, pride and love swelling in her chest. "She's a good girl," she whispered. "I can see that," William replied. He reached for the envelope of cash, tapping it lightly against his palm before holding it out to Grace. "Here," he said, "take this." Grace shook her head immediately. "Oh, no, sir. I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," William interrupted firmly. "It's a gift, a thank you. Or if you prefer business terms, a bonus for the most honest employee I've ever met." Grace hesitated, her hands trembling. The envelope seemed heavy, not just with money but with meaning. "I can't accept this," she said quietly. "You've already done more than enough." William sighed, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Mrs. Miller, I've spent a lifetime giving money to people who didn't deserve it. For once, let me give it to someone who does." He looked at Lily. "Buy her a proper coat and some new shoes. Maybe a bed that doesn't squeak every time she moves." Grace's lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked rapidly, the emotion in her throat too thick to speak. Finally, she nodded and reached out with trembling hands to accept the envelope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. William leaned back, his gaze still fixed on the little girl. "And you," he said softly, "you've got quite a heart, Lily Miller. The world could use more people like you." Lily smiled shyly, swinging her legs a little. "Thank you, Mr. Hartman." For a moment, the three of them sat there, the fire warming their faces, the storm outside fading into a steady rain. It was the first time in years that the Grand Library felt alive. William took a deep breath, the kind that fills more than lungs. It filled the empty spaces in his soul. Then, as if a new thought struck him, he turned to Grace. "I'd like to make another arrangement," he said. Grace blinked. "An arrangement?" He nodded. "I'd like to help your daughter. She's bright, thoughtful, she deserves opportunities. I want to pay for her schooling private, if you'll allow it. All the way through college, if she wants to go." Grace's jaw fell open. "Mr. Hartman, that's far too generous. I couldn't let you." "You can," he interrupted gently, "and you will, because I insist." He smiled again, faint but sincere. "Let's call it an investment. I've wasted millions on bad ones. It's about time I made a good one." Grace covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling freely now. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll let me," William replied. Lily looked up at her mother, eyes bright with wonder. "Mommy, does that mean I can go to the big school with the playground?" Grace laughed through her tears. "Maybe it does, sweetheart." She turned back to William. "I don't know how to thank you." He waved her off. "Don't, just promise me one thing." "Anything," Grace said quickly. "Keep her the way she is," he said quietly. "Don't let the world take that goodness away from her. People will try. Money will try, but she's rare. Protect that." Grace nodded, emotion tightening her chest. "I will." William stood slowly, leaning on his cane. He walked to the window, watching the rain run in streaks down the glass. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the mansion pressing on him. He felt lighter, freer. He turned back to them, his expression softer than anyone had seen in decades. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Both of you. We'll discuss the details." Grace hesitated. "Are you sure, sir?" "I'm sure," he said, "and call me William. Sir sounds too cold." Grace smiled faintly. "All right, William." Lily grinned. "Bye, Mr. William." As they walked toward the door, William looked down at the little ballerina on the table. He reached out and picked it up again, holding it carefully in his palm. "I'll keep this, if that's all right," he said. Lily turned around, her face lighting up. "Okay," she said cheerfully, "but you have to take good care of her. She's my favorite." "I will," he promised. The door closed behind them, and for a long while, William just stood there, staring at the tiny toy in his hand. The fire burned low, casting soft light across the room. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel alone. The mansion didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a home, one that, perhaps, had just found its missing heartbeat. That night, as he placed the ballerina on his bedside table, William Hartman realized that his so-called test had never been about anyone else. It had always been about him, and in the kindness of a child, he had finally passed. Grace and Lily's visit left William awake long after the fire burned down to red coals. He sat in the armchair, the little porcelain ballerina standing next to the envelope, feeling as if a hole had been opened somewhere deep inside him and light was pouring through. For the first time in years, he wanted the morning to come. When it did, he called his lawyer, called his doctor, called the housekeeper and the contractor who took care of the grounds. He began giving instructions. The spare bedroom should be painted, the garden gate repaired, the fountain cleaned. "We were expecting guests," he said simply, and no one dared to ask who. A week later, Grace and Lily returned. The girl ran to the window where she could see the lake, and William found himself smiling at her questions about boats, ducks, and the strange machine that trimmed the hedges. He told her she could sit in the library whenever she liked, that there were books about everything from stars to horses, and that if she wanted to learn how anything worked, He would find someone to teach her. He set up a small desk beside his own and stocked it with pencils, colored markers, and paper. When Grace tried to thank him again for the envelope, he stopped her. "That was a transaction between your daughter and me," he said. "She gave me something priceless. I'm just paying the invoice." The weeks became months. Lily came every afternoon after school while Grace worked in other parts of the house. Sometimes she did homework. Sometimes she asked William questions about business or the world or what it felt like to build something from nothing. He discovered that he liked answering her. She had a way of listening that made him feel as if his stories mattered again. On the days when his joints ached and the gray of Seattle pressed down like fog, her laughter filled the mansion until it sounded less like an empty mausoleum and more like a place where people lived. Grace changed too. She stopped flinching when she spoke to him. He raised her salary, then promoted her to manage the household staff. She proved as disciplined and sharp as she was kind. Soon she was running the charitable arm of his company, designing programs that sent scholarships to families like hers. William watched her work and wondered how many lives he might have changed sooner if he hadn't spent so much time guarding himself from the world. One evening 2 years after the test, William sat by the fire and called Lily over. She was taller now, her hair tied in a loose braid, her school uniform smudged with chalk. He held out the porcelain ballerina, still cracked but polished clean. "I keep this on my desk," he said. "Do you know why?" She shook her head. "Because it reminds me that everything important in life is fragile, and you don't throw away what's fragile. You protect it." Lily nodded solemnly, and he smiled. "That includes people." Years passed like that, each one softer than the last. Grace took on more responsibility, helping William reorganize his foundation. Lily grew into a bright, confident teenager, visiting the mansion after class to help catalog his old books or keep him company during dinner. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blake, once whispered that she hadn't seen the old man laugh so much in 20 years. He started hosting small gatherings again, inviting local artists, teachers, and students from the neighborhood. He donated a wing of the city library in Grace's name and started a mentorship program for young engineers. Reporters called it a late life transformation. He called it gratitude. By the time Lily turned 17, she had been accepted into one of the best schools in the state. William attended her scholarship ceremony in person, leaning on his cane but standing proud. When she thanked him in her speech, saying he had shown her that kindness could build empires, he had to wipe his eyes behind his sunglasses. Not long after, on a calm Sunday morning, William Hartman passed away in his sleep. He was found in his favorite chair by the library window, the ballerina still on the table beside him. The news spread quickly. The media called him a reformed billionaire, a philanthropist who had spent his last decade giving away most of his fortune. But the true story of what changed him belonged only to Grace and Lily. At the reading of his will, the large oak conference room in his downtown office was filled with lawyers, accountants, and his estranged children. The lawyer began with formalities. Each child would receive their trust fund properties and certain investments. They nodded impatiently, already calculating profits. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and continued the remainder of Billionaire. Hartman's estate, including Hartman Technologies, the Lake Washington residence, and all personal holdings shall pass to Miss Lely Miller. Gasp filled the room. His children erupted in protest. Grace held her daughter's hand tightly as the lawyer produced a letter written in William's shaky handwriting. The letter read, "To my children I have left you wealth. To Lily I leave everything else. 10 years ago, a child gave me the one thing all my riches could not buy, a reason to believe in good again. She taught me that generosity is not a transaction but a way of living. She saved my soul from its own fortune. I hope she spends this gift the way she gave her own, freely." When the letter ended, no one spoke. The lawyer handed Lily a small velvet box. Inside, resting on white silk, was the ballerina repaired, its missing arm replaced with a sliver of gold. Lily touched it gently, tears forming in her eyes. She didn't care about the billions or the mansion or the cameras waiting outside. All she could think about was the old man who had once been so cold, sitting by the fire pretending to sleep. Later, when she and Grace returned to the estate, the first thing Lily did was place the ballerina on the same table beside the armchair. The rain had begun to fall again, tapping against the glass, just as it had that first day. "Safe now," she whispered, smiling through her tears. Over the following years, Lily kept her promise to William. She ran the Hartman Foundation with her mother, expanding it into schools, hospitals, and community centers. She refused to live in luxury. Instead, she poured her inheritance into rebuilding broken neighborhoods, offering jobs, education, and hope. People began calling her the kind-hearted billionaire, though she always laughed at that. "I just learned from the best," she would say, pointing to a framed photo of William sitting beside her on the library steps. Both of them laughing. and every time someone asked where her compassion came from, she would take a small box from her desk, open it, and show the little ballerina with its golden arm. From this, she'd say, and from the man who taught me that sometimes the richest people are the ones who learn how to give. The last few months of William Hartman's life unfolded like the slow turning of autumn leaves, quiet, reflective, and full of color. The doctors had warned him that his heart was weakening, but he brushed it off with a dry laugh. "It's just tired," he told Grace one afternoon as she poured him tea. 76 years of pumping guilt and stubbornness can wear any heart out. He said it as a joke, but she saw through it. His steps had grown slower, his naps longer. Yet even as his body weakened, his spirit seemed lighter than ever. The mansion that once felt like a fortress now buzzed with life. Staff came and went freely, the smell of cooking replaced the musty scent of dust. And laughter Lily's ladder floated through the hallways like sunlight finding cracks in old stone. William spent his mornings in the library, his favorite room, surrounded by the same books that had once kept him company during years of self-imposed solitude. Lily often joined him after school, her backpack dropping by the door before she climbed into the chair opposite his. They read together, sometimes she out loud, he quietly, or they just talked. She told him about her classes, her favorite teachers, the friends she was making. He told her about the early days of his company, the deals that built his empire, the mistakes that nearly destroyed it. She loved those stories, not for the money or the power in them, but for the lessons hidden underneath. He noticed that. It made him proud, though he never said it outright. One chilly afternoon in November, William sat by the window, watching the lake ripple under a gray sky. The trees along the shore were bare now, their leaves scattered across the lawn like gold coins abandoned by the wind. Grace entered with his medication, but he waved her off. "Later," he said. "Let me have a few more minutes with my thoughts before the pills start making me feel like cardboard." She smiled softly. "You've been writing again?" she asked, glancing at the notebook on his lap. He nodded. "Letters," he said. "Things I should have said years ago." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. She knew better than anyone that William was a man who revealed himself in pieces, not paragraphs. That evening, when Grace and Lily left the mansion, he stayed in the library long after the fire had burned down to embers. The only light came from the desk lamp and the faint glow of the city across the water. He opened his notebook, the same one Lily had picked up off the floor 10 years ago, and began to write. His handwriting was uneven now, shaky in places, but the words flowed easily. "My dearest Lily," he began, "if you rereading this, it means I've taken my final nap in that old chair you used to call my thinking spot. Don't be sad. I've had more years than I ever deserved, and the last 10 have been my favorite. You once told me that when someone is cold, you give them warmth, no matter who they are. You may not realize it, but you gave that warmth to me long before I earned it." He paused, smiling faintly as he remembered the small pink jacket across his knees, the shy voice that had said, "Cold is cold. Before you and your mother came into this house, I was a man surrounded by everything and everyone money could buy, but completely alone. I tested people because I was afraid of what I'd find if I stopped. I told myself that mistrust kept me safe. But the truth is, it kept me empty. You changed that. You showed me that generosity doesn't belong to the rich. It belongs to the brave. It belongs to people who give even when they have little to spare." He stopped writing for a moment, staring at the ballerina on the table beside him. Its golden arm glinted faintly in the lamplight. "That little toy you gave me is still my greatest treasure. I had it repaired, but not to erase the crack it needed to stay. The gold in its arm isn't there to make it more valuable. It's there to remind me that broken things can be beautiful when they're remended with care. People are like that too. You and your mother mended something in me I thought was gone forever." He turned the page, his eyes wet but steady. "By the time you read this, my lawyers will have explained the practical matters, the money, the estate, the company. I know it's a lot, maybe too much. Don't let it change you. Don't let it build walls around you like it did around me. Use it to build doors instead. Let people in. Give them a chance to surprise you the way you surprised me." He leaned back, breathing slowly, the ache in his chest growing heavier. Still he kept writing. "I want you to promise me something, Lily. Promise me that when the world makes you cynical, when it tells you that kindness is weakness, you all remember an old man in a leather chair who learned otherwise from a little girl with a pink jacket. Keep that lesson alive, teach it to others, let it be the legacy that outlives both of us." He hesitated, then wrote one last paragraph. "And to your mother, Grace, thank you for trusting me with your child, for forgiving my mistakes, and for reminding me what family feels like. I hope you'll both think of this house as yours. I built it as a monument to success. You turned it into a home." He signed his name, placed the letter inside a new envelope, and set it beside the ballerina. Then for the first time in years he felt completely at peace. Over the next few weeks his strength faded. He spent most days in the library, napping under the same window where he'd once waited for people to fail him. Sometimes Lily would find him there, pretending to read while his eyes were half closed. She'd tease him, calling him Mr. William the Wise. He'd smile, pretending to be grumpy. "You keep calling me that, and I'll start charging tuition," he'd say. She'd laugh, and that laugh would fill the room like sunlight. One cold December morning, Grace arrived early to bring him breakfast. The fire was still burning low, and the room looked just as it always did. William was in his armchair, the blanket drawn neatly over his knees, his head tilted slightly to one side. At first she thought he was asleep. She set down the tray and stepped closer. The letter on the table caught her eye, her name and Lily's written on the front in shaky handwriting. Her heart dropped. She reached for his wrist, felt the stillness, and knew. A few hours later, when Lily arrived, Grace knelt beside her, holding her daughter close as she explained. The girl didn't cry right away. She just stared at the chair, at the old man who had become her friend, her mentor, almost her grandfather. Then she noticed the ballerina and the envelope beside it. She picked them up with trembling hands. The letter became their keepsake. Grace framed it eventually, but Lily carried the words inside her heart. Whenever she faced a difficult choice, she heard his voice in her mind, steady, kind, a little gruff, use it to build doors, not walls. Years later, when Lily grew up and stood on the stage of a university that bore his name, she told the audience about the man who had taught her that wealth meant nothing without generosity. She didn't mention the money or the estate. She spoke about the pink jacket, the ballerina, and a cold old man who'd learned to love again. That night after the ceremony, she returned to the mansion, her mansion now, and placed the ballerina back on the table where he'd left it. The rain tapped softly on the window. She whispered, "Safe now," and smiled. Somewhere beyond the storm, she imagined William Hartman smiling too. The day of the will reading dawned, gray and wet, the kind of Seattle morning where the sky seemed too heavy for its own good. The rain fell steadily over downtown, streaking across the windows of the tall glass building that bore William Hartman's name. Inside, the conference room on the top floor was filled with people, his attorneys, his business partners, his estranged children, and, seated quietly at the end of the long oak table, Grace and Lily Miller. It felt strange for them to be there, surrounded by men in expensive suits and women who wore grief like a fashionable accessory. Grace held her daughter's hand beneath the table, squeezing it gently. Lily's heart pounded. She had never been in a room so big, so cold, so full of eyes that didn't know what to make of her. At the head of the table stood Mr. Caldwell, William's longtime attorney. He was an older man, white-haired and meticulous, his glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. He cleared his throat and looked down at the stack of papers before him. "We are here today to execute the final will and testament of Mr. William Everett Hartman," he began. The sound of his voice filled the room, heavy and formal. William's 3 children, Thomas, Daniel, and Rebecca, sat together across from Grace and Lily, their expressions tense and impatient. They looked nothing like their father except for the sharpness in their eyes, the kind that measured everything in gain or loss. Caldwell continued, reading through the initial legalities, the confirmation of William's passing, the inventory of assets, the acknowledgement of debts, all standard procedure. Thomas shifted in his chair, muttering under his breath. Rebecca leaned back, arms crossed, while Daniel checked his watch, as if the reading of their father's will was just another meeting to get through before lunch. When Caldwell reached the section about the distribution of assets, the atmosphere shifted. He read clearly, "To my children Thomas, Daniel, and Rebecca Hartman, I leave the trust funds established at your birth, along with the properties previously deeded in your names." Thomas smirked faintly. He had expected nothing less. The lawyer went on, "These accounts, as you know, are valued in the millions, and I trust that will satisfy your ambitions." Daniel whispered something to Rebecca, and she nodded, both looking smug. Grace exhaled softly, relieved that they seemed content, ready to leave. But then Caldwell paused, flipping to the next page. His voice lowered slightly, the tone shifting from procedural to personal. "To the remainder of my estate," he read, "including all ownership shares of Hartman Technologies, the Lake Washington residence, all vehicles, art, investments, and remaining personal assets, I leave them to one individual." The room went still, every head turned toward Caldwell. He looked up, his eyes finding the young girl sitting beside her mother at the end of the table. "Miss Lily Miller." The words seemed to hang in the air like thunder. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Then the storm broke. Thomas shot to his feet. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. "That's a joke, right? The maid's kid." Rebecca gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth. Daniel leaned forward, disbelief painted across his face. "That can't be right." "Read it again," Caldwell didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses and read on. To Miss Lily Miller, I leave all remaining holdings and properties, to be managed under the oversight of Grace Miller until Lily reaches legal age. This decision is final and made with full understanding and clarity of mind. Thomas slammed his fist against the table. He was senile! You think we were going to believe that a child some nobody deserves everything? He must have been manipulated. Caldwell lifted a hand calmly. There is a letter attached to the will, he said. Mr. Hartman requested it be read aloud. He unfolded a separate page written in William's familiar handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. His voice softened as he began. To my children and to the world, he read, you will no doubt call this decision madness. Perhaps it is. But if it is madness, it's the kind born of regret, not confusion. For years I measured people by their worth on paper and found them wanting. I built empires and lost myself in the process. Then, 10 years ago, a little girl reminded me that wealth means nothing if it cannot be shared. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Lily sat perfectly still, her small hands clasped together in her lap. Caldwell continued reading, his voice steady. That day, she gave me her jacket when she thought I was cold. She protected my money when she could have stolen it. And when she believed she had done wrong, she offered me her most precious possession, a broken toy that had belonged to her father. In that moment, she gave me something I had never found in all my riches, compassion without expectation. Through her, I learned that generosity is not about value, it's about heart. A murmur spread around the table. Thomas and Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. Daniel sat rigid, his jaw tight. Caldwell read the final lines. So to her, I leave not only my wealth but my faith. She is the person I wish I had been, and the person I hope my family can learn from. I am not rewarding her for obedience, but for reminding me that even the coldest hearts can be warmed by kindness. May this inheritance serve as proof that giving is the truest form of living. He lowered the paper, folding it carefully. The room was thick with tension. No one spoke for several seconds until Thomas broke the quiet with a furious scoff. He lost his mind, he said. He was manipulated by that woman. His eyes cut toward Grace like daggers. You think this will stand? We'll take it to court. Caldwell met his glare evenly. You can try, he said, but you will lose. Mr. Hartman updated his will every 6 months. This version was notarized only 3 weeks before his passing. He was in sound mind and documented by both his doctor and myself. Rebecca stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. This is ridiculous, she snapped. He didn't even know them 10 years ago. And he gives them everything. Grace finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. He knew us, she said, and we didn't ask for any of this. She looked at her daughter, who was sitting quietly, her face pale but composed. He chose her because she reminded him how to be human. Thomas shook his head and stormed toward the door, muttering about lawyers and fraud. Daniel followed, his expression unreadable. Rebecca lingered for a moment, her eyes darting between Grace and Lily, then sighed and left without a word. When the door closed, the only people left were Grace, Lily, and Mr. Caldwell. The lawyer gathered the papers and slid a small velvet box across the table toward Lily. He wanted you to have this, he said. Lily opened it carefully. Inside, resting on a cushion of white silk, was the porcelain ballerina, its missing arm now replaced by a delicate piece of gold. She touched it gently, her fingers tracing the smooth metal, her throat tightened. He fixed her, she whispered. Caldwell smiled faintly. He said she reminded him of you. Grace wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were mixed with pride and love. The lawyer stood, gathering his briefcase. Mr. Hartman asked me to tell you something else, he said before leaving. He said make sure they know I wasn't saving them. They were saving me. When they walked out of the building, the rain had stopped. The clouds had begun to break apart, letting thin streaks of sunlight spill across the city. Lily looked up at the sky, clutching the little ballerina in her hand. He said the sun always comes out after the storm, she whispered. Grace smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. He was right, she said. And as they walked toward the car, the city around them gleaming in the wet light, it felt as if William Hartman's final lesson was written in the air itself, that even after the hardest storms, kindness always finds a way to shine through. The years that followed the reading of William Hartman's will became the most transformative of Lily Miller's life. Overnight, her world expanded from a small apartment in Rainier Valley to a vast estate overlooking Lake Washington. From public school hallways with peeling paint to private meetings with bankers, investors, and journalists who couldn't stop asking the same question, what will you do with all that money? At first, she didn't know. She was only 17, still more comfortable with a notebook and a cup of cocoa than with the heavy responsibility of an empire. But she remembered what William had written in his letter, use it to build doors, not walls. So that's what she did. Under Grace's guidance, the first thing Lily established was the Hartman Foundation for Hope, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting children who grew up the way she had with little money but big dreams. The mansion became its headquarters. The Grand Library, once a cold symbol of wealth, was transformed into a study center filled with books, computers, and tutors. The long dining room table became a place where kids from struggling families sat to eat warm meals and do homework under the same chandeliers that had once hosted business meetings worth millions. Grace oversaw everything with quiet pride, and Lily made it her mission to ensure every corner of that house stayed open to the community. In the beginning, some people doubted her. The media painted her as the teenage heiress of Seattle, a story too good to be true, the Maid's daughter inheriting billions from a lonely billionaire. They waited for her to stumble, for greed or inexperience to turn her fortune into a scandal. But Lily ignored the noise. She wasn't interested in headlines. She worked long days and longer nights, learning about philanthropy, economics, and law. She read every file William had ever kept, trying to understand the mind of the man who had trusted her with his life's work. By the time she turned 21, she had already made her mark. She sold one of William's smaller companies, a luxury goods manufacturer, and used the profits to fund after-school programs across Washington state. She partnered with universities to offer scholarships for children of single parents. She built housing for low-income families near the docks where William's shipping line once operated. When reporters asked why she focused on ordinary people instead of expanding the tech empire she had inherited, she smiled and said, "Because he already built machines. Now it's time to build people." Grace watched her daughter with admiration and awe. She had worried, at first, that so much money and attention might change Lily, but it never did. The girl who had once given away her jacket still preferred thrift store clothes to designer dresses. The woman she became still kept her father's old ballerina toy on her desk, its golden arm gleaming under the office lights. Every morning before work, she'd tap it gently, whispering, "Let's do some good today." The foundation grew beyond Seattle. Within 5 years, there were Hartman centers in Portland, Denver, and San Francisco, each one providing free education, meals, and mentorship for children in need. Lily visited every location personally, refusing to be a distant benefactor. She met each child, learned their names, their stories. She laughed with them, read with them, and when they asked about the man whose name was on the door, she told them about William Hartman, not the billionaire, but the man who once pretended to sleep so he could test the world, and how a little kindness woke him up. Her words inspired thousands. Investors who had once ignored philanthropy began donating. Volunteers poured in. Her foundation became a movement. People started calling her the girl who built hope. She didn't like titles, but she couldn't deny that something magical had happened. What began as a single act of compassion, a child offering her jacket, had rippled outward into something far bigger than any fortune could measure. As Lily's influence grew, so did the temptation to lose herself in work. Grace often reminded her to rest, to live, to be young. "William wouldn't want you to turn his gift into a burden," she'd say. So on weekends, Lily took long walks around the estate, down to the dock where the lake met the woods. That was where she felt closest to him. Sometimes she would sit on the bench by the water, holding the ballerina in her hand, and talk to him out loud, telling him about the new school wing, the hundreds of kids they'd helped, the letters of thanks that arrived every week. It became her ritual. 10 years after William's passing, the mansion hosted a celebration. The Hartman Foundation had officially built its 10th school, this one in Tacoma, and hundreds of guests filled the garden, from donors to families whose lives had been changed by Lily's programs. Reporters wandered among the crowd, cameras flashing, but Lily didn't care about the spectacle. She stood on the small stage by the fountain, wearing a simple navy dress, her mother beside her. Grace's hair was streaked with gray now, but her smile hadn't aged a day. Lily took the microphone and looked out over the crowd. 10 years ago, she began, her voice steady. A man who had everything believed he had nothing, and a little girl who had nothing showed him he already had everything that mattered. That man was William Hartman. He gave me his name, his home, and his trust. But what he really gave me was a lesson that kindness isn't weakness. It's power, real power. She paused, scanning the faces before her. He used to say that money can build walls or it can build doors. I hope he'd be proud to see that we've built a few doors together. The crowd erupted in applause. Grace wiped her eyes. Lily smiled, glancing toward the mansion's library window, where the curtains fluttered slightly in the wind. For a moment, she could almost see him sitting there in his old chair, watching, proud and amused as ever. That night, after everyone left, Lily walked through the quiet halls of the mansion. She entered the library and stood before the armchair, still there, still facing the window. The air smelled faintly of old books and cedar, just as it always had. She ran her fingers along the edge of the table and picked up the ballerina. Its golden arm caught the moonlight, "We did it. William," she whispered, "we built doors." She set the toy back down and turned toward the window. Outside, the lake shimmered under the stars. The rain that had started so many years ago had long passed, but its memory remained, the sound of it against the glass. The feeling of a small act changing a life. In the years to come, Lily would continue expanding the foundation worldwide. She would visit schools in Africa, build hospitals in South America, and speak at global summits about compassion-driven leadership. Yet no matter where she went, she carried William's letter with her folded neatly, edges worn, words fading. It was her compass. And when people asked how she managed to do so much good in a world so cynical, she always gave the same answer: because someone once believed in me before I believed in myself. The Hartman legacy didn't end with money or buildings. It lived on in every child who found warmth, food, and hope through Lily's work. It lived on in the laughter echoing through the library, in the community garden that grew outside the mansion gates, in the generations that followed who learned that kindness was not just an act, it was a way of life. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet hum of the rain against the windows of that grand old house, the man who once doubted the goodness of the world could finally rest, knowing that the heart he'd rediscovered in a small, brave girl had gone on to change it forever. 15 years had passed since the day Lily Miller inherited William Hartman's empire, and the world had changed in ways that even he could never have predicted. The Hartman Foundation had grown from a local charity into an international network of schools, clinics, and innovation centers. Across 3 continents, buildings bore the name Hartman Hope Institute, not as monuments to wealth but as beacons of compassion. Lily had become a woman admired not for her fortune, but for the way she used it, steady, thoughtful, and fearless in her kindness. Reporters still called her the girl who gave everything back, and though she always laughed at the title, there was truth in it. Every year she gave more, and every year the world gave back in ways that could never be measured in money. Her life had not been without challenges. Managing an empire of generosity required more strength than managing a corporation. There were betrayals, mistakes, and people who tried to twist her name for their own gain. But through every trial, she carried William's words like armor: build doors, not walls. When business partners pushed for profit over purpose, she reminded them that a company without humanity was just machinery with no heartbeat. When politicians tried to use her influence for their campaigns, she quietly declined and built a school instead. The press called her the unshakable philanthropist, but those who worked closely with her knew she simply refused to forget where she came from. By her mid-30s, Lily had become something of a mentor herself. Every week, she met with a group of young entrepreneurs at the Foundation's Seattle headquarters, a modern glass building overlooking the same lake where William's mansion stood. The group came from all walks of life: students, dreamers, children from shelters who'd grown up under her programs. They gathered around a long table, notebooks open, eager to learn how to turn compassion into action. Lily never lectured, she told stories instead. One afternoon, as the rain washed over the city like an old memory, Lily stood before them with her hands resting lightly on the table. "When I was your age," she said, "I thought success meant escaping where I came from. I thought I had to climb out of the world I grew up in and never look back. But then I met a man who taught me that real success isn't about leaving people behind, it's about bringing them with you." She paused, glancing at the ballerina figurine that sat at the end of the table. She carried it everywhere she went. Its golden arm gleamed under the soft office lights. "He once told me something I've never forgotten," she continued. "Kindness isn't weakness, it's power, real power." The group was quiet, hanging on every word. A boy in the front row, no older than 17, raised his hams. "Miller," he said, "weren't you scared back then? I mean, when you first got all that money?" Lily smiled, terrified. She admitted, "I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know if people liked me or the fortune. But then I remembered what he taught me, that fear makes walls and generosity makes doors. So I stopped worrying about who would take from me and started focusing on who I could lift." She looked around the table. "That's what this foundation is for, not to make the world owe us, but to remind it that kindness still matters." After the session, she stayed behind to speak with one of the students, a girl named Mia who reminded her so much of herself at that age. Wide eyes, a smile, a heart full of hope and fear. Maya came from a rough background, raised by a single mother working part-time while studying architecture. "I don't think I'm brave enough to do what you do," Mia confessed. "People take advantage of me. I give and they just keep taking." Lily rested a hand on her shoulder. "People will take," she said softly. "That's part of life. But if you stop giving because of that, you will lose something bigger: your faith in goodness. You can't control how others act, only how you do. Generosity is a gamble, but it's the only one worth playing." She smiled gently. Someone once gambled on me. I'm still paying it forward. That evening, when the students had gone home, Lily walked down to the lake. The sun had dipped low, painting the water in shades of silver and rose. The mansion stood across the property, its lights glowing warmly. She still lived there, though she had opened half of it to visiting scholars and families in need. The grand rooms, once filled with isolation, now carried the hum of laughter, footsteps, and life. As she approached the library, the place where everything had begun, she paused at the door. Inside, the old armchair still sat by the fire. She kept it exactly as it was, a quiet tribute to the man who had once occupied it. On the mantel above the fireplace hung a portrait of William Hartman, not in his corporate days, but an image painted from memory softer. Kind-eyed, dressed in his favorite sweater instead of a suit. Beneath it sat the framed letter he had written to her and her mother, yellowed with age but still legible. Every visitor who came through the foundation was brought here to read it, to understand where all this had started. That night Grace joined her, her hair now fully silver, her hands still as gentle as ever. She handed Lily a cup of tea and sat beside her near the fire. "He'd be proud of you, you know," Grace said. Lily nodded slowly. "I hope so. You've done more than anyone thought possible," her mother continued. "He gave you a fortune, but you turned it into a heartbeat. That's something no one can measure." Lily looked toward the ballerina resting on the table. The firelight caught the gold in its arm, making it shimmer. "He taught me that broken things can be beautiful," she said softly. "And that people can be mended too." Grace reached over and squeezed her hand. "You mended him," she whispered. They sat together, watching the lake reflect the night sky, the sound of the rain returning faintly against the windows. In the years that followed, Lily became not only a philanthropist but a teacher of humanity itself. Universities invited her to speak about ethics and empathy in business. Governments sought her counsel on sustainable charity models. She always began her talks the same way: "I was raised by a mother who worked for a man who didn't believe in kindness." Until one day, kindness found him. Her story became legend not because it was glamorous, but because it was real. Students quoted her speeches. Documentaries were made about the Hartman legacy. But through it all, she remained grounded. Every Christmas, she and Grace hosted a dinner at the mansion for children from the foundation. They called it William's Feast, and at the end of the night, Lily would tell them the story of the pink jacket and the cold old man by the fire. She always ended with the same words: "Never underestimate what one good thing can do. Even the smallest kindness can rewrite a life or save one." One year, as the children gathered around the fire, Maya, now grown and working as an architect for the foundation, approached Lily with a gift. It was a small box wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a new porcelain ballerina, identical to the old one but unbroken. Lily held it up, smiling. "She's beautiful," she said. Maya nodded. "You told me once that generosity is a gamble. I figured it's time I start playing." Lily placed the new ballerina beside the old one on the mantel. The two figures stood together, one whole, one mended, symbols of everything she'd learned. She looked up at William's portrait and whispered, "The doors are still open." Outside, the rain eased, and the moon broke through the clouds, its reflection rippling across the lake. The mansion, once cold and lonely, now glowed with warmth, laughter, and life, proof that a single act of kindness could ripple across generations, turning even the darkest house into a home that would never again know emptiness. By the time Lily Miller turned 68, the name Hartman had come to mean something far greater than wealth. Across the country and across oceans, it was whispered in schools, hospitals, and community centers as a symbol of opportunity, compassion, and second chances. The Hartman Foundation had grown into one of the world's most respected humanitarian organizations, with over 100 programs across 30 nations. And at its heart still stood the same woman who had once been just a child in a pink jacket, shivering in front of a fire in a stranger's mansion. The years had carved fine lines around her eyes, but her gaze still carried the same light it always had: steady, warm, unflinching. Her hair, once chestnut brown, had faded into silver, tied neatly as she worked long days in her office overlooking Lake Washington. From her window, she could see the same dock where she used to talk to William in her teenage years, and beyond it, the reflection of the mansion, now known as the Hartman Home for Hope. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was a living institution. Every week, young dreamers stayed there to learn, to plan, to build something better. It had become a sanctuary for ideas and kindness alike. Grace had passed away 5 years earlier, peacefully, surrounded by family and the sound of laughter from the children she used to care for. Her absence had left an ache that time couldn't fully heal, but Lily carried her memory like a soft warmth that never faded. Sometimes, when she walked through the library, she could almost hear her mother humming softly as she worked, her voice blending with the quiet rhythm of the rain against the windows. One autumn evening, Lily sat by the fire in the same armchair William Hartman had once occupied. The ballerina figurine, its golden arm glinting in the flickering light, stood on the mantel beside a newer one, the gift from Maya, who now led one of the Foundation's largest international programs. The room had changed in color and furniture, but the spirit remained untouched. On the wall above the fireplace hung 3 portraits: William, Grace, and herself, 3 generations bound not by blood but by compassion. She opened an old notebook resting on her lap, the same one William had once written in. Over the years, she had filled it with her own words, lessons learned, letters to her mother, reflections on life. On the first page was still his handwriting, the original note she kept all these decades ago. Beneath it, in her own looping script, she had written, "Kindness outlives us." That night, as the fire burned low, Lily began writing what she knew would be her last letter, not to a lawyer or a foundation board, but to the next generation. To whoever finds this journal, she began, "I hope by the time you read these words, the world has grown softer, not harder. I hope you understand that kindness is not a luxury. It's the thread that holds everything together. I was taught that by 2 people, my mother, Grace, who taught me to give without fear, and a man named William Hartman, who taught me to trust again." Her pen paused as she smiled faintly, thinking of him. He left me everything he had, but the real inheritance wasn't his money. It was the lesson that wealth means nothing without heart. I've tried to live by that lesson every day since. If you ever find yourself wondering what difference one small act can make, remember this: I once gave my jacket to a stranger, and it changed both our lives. She set the pen down and leaned back, watching the fire. The room seemed to hum with memories: William's deep laugh, her mother's soft voice, the joyful chatter of children from 100 charity dinners. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling peace settle in her chest. She wasn't tired of living, but she was ready to rest. The next morning, the staff found her still in the chair, her notebook resting open on her lap. The fire burned down to faint embers. Her expression was calm, her lips curved in the smallest, most contented smile. On the table beside her sat the 2 ballerinas, one broken and mended, the other whole, their porcelain faces reflecting the early light streaming through the window. News of her passing spread quickly. Within hours, messages poured in from around the world. Former students, now doctors, teachers, and engineers, wrote about how Lily's foundation had changed their lives. Politicians praised her as one of the most influential humanitarians of the century. Newspapers printed her story alongside headlines about legacy, love, and the power of giving. But for those who truly knew her, no headline could capture who she was. To them, she was not just Lily Miller, heir of Hartman, but the woman who turned kindness into a movement. The following week, thousands gathered at the mansion for her memorial. The sky was gray, as if Seattle itself was grieving. The ceremony took place in the garden where she had once hosted the Foundation's 10th anniversary. Children she had once helped now stood as adults, carrying white lilies in her honor. Maya, her pra'i, spoke first. "She always said kindness was the only currency that never loses its value," Maya began, her voice trembling. "She taught us that wealth isn't what you hold, it's what you share." And she shared everything. After the speeches, the guests were invited inside the library. The armchair remained where it always had, facing the lake, and above the fireplace hung a new inscription engraved in brass: "Kindness outlives us." Beneath it, on the table, stood the 2 ballerinas side by side. The old one's golden arm glowed faintly in the firelight, and beside it, the new one shimmered with perfect grace. Together they told the story better than any words could, one broken and healed, one whole, both eternal. In the years that followed, her story became part of the Foundation's curriculum. Children learned about the billionaire who tested humanity and the girl who passed the test with nothing but her compassion. Every year on her birthday, the Hartman home opened its doors to the public for a celebration called the Day of Giving. People from across the city came to volunteer, donate, and share stories about acts of kindness. Maya continued Lily's work, expanding the Foundation's reach and ensuring her mentor's values never faded. She often said that when she faced hard choices, she would walk into the library, look at Lily's portrait, and hear her voice saying, "Doors, not walls." Decades later, long after the mansion became a historic landmark, visitors would still gather by the window where the old chair stood. Tour guides told the story of the child who had once offered her jacket to a stranger, and how that single gesture had built an empire of kindness. Outside, the lake reflected the sky, and when it rained, as it often did in Seattle, the drops tapped gently against the glass, like a reminder. And if you listened closely, some swore you could almost hear her voice in the rhythm of the storm, whispering the same words that had defined her life and changed the world. Cold as cold, kindness is everything. The story of William Hartman and Lily Miller became more than a tale. It became a legend, whispered in classrooms, retold at dinner tables, quoted by teachers and parents and dreamers who needed to believe that good still existed in the world. Decades passed and yet the lake never changed. It still mirrored the sky in shades of gray and gold, its water rippling gently beneath the same Seattle rain that had once set everything in motion. The mansion, now preserved as a national landmark, stood proudly on the hill, its glass windows glowing like lanterns at dusk. People called it the house that kindness built. Visitors came from everywhere. Some came to take photos, others to feel what it was like to stand in the place where one small act had changed so many lives. But those who truly understood didn't come for the grandeur, they came for the quiet power that seemed to live in the walls. Guides would lead them through the hallways, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished wood. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and old books. And when they reached the library, the heart of it all, they always fell still. The armchair remained exactly where it had always been, facing the large window that overlooked the lake. The table beside it held 2 porcelain ballerinas, one mended with gold, one whole. Between them sat a framed photograph of 3 people, an old man with kind eyes, a woman with silver hair, and a little girl in a pink jacket standing between them, smiling. Below the photo was a small brass plaque engraved with 4 simple words, "Kindness outlives us all." When the tours ended, the guides often lingered by that chair, their voices dropping as they shared the story in a tone reserved for sacred things. They spoke of William Hartman, the billionaire who had once doubted everyone and everything, until a little girl's compassion that a heart turned to stone. They spoke of Grace Miller, the mother who worked quietly, loved fiercely, and never stopped believing in decency no matter how hard the world tested her. And they spoke of Lily, the girl who built an empire not from profit, but from love, and proved that one selfless moment could ripple across time. On certain rainy evenings, when the last visitors had gone and the doors were locked, the caretakers swore the house seemed to breathe again. The fire in the library would flicker higher without reason, casting moving light across the portraits. The air would feel warmer, softer, as if the house remembered. Sometimes, when the wind pressed against the windows, it carried faint laughter, a child's giggle, a woman's hum, the deep, warm chuckle of an old man. Those who heard it said it didn't feel haunting, it felt like home. The foundation continued to thrive, led by new generations inspired by Lily's vision. They built schools in deserts, clinics in mountains, and learning centers in cities where children had once had no safe place to dream. In every building's lobby, a small statue of a ballerina stood near the entrance, her golden arm catching the light. No words were needed. Everyone knew what it meant. She had become a universal symbol, a reminder that beauty could come from what was once broken, that mended things could shine even brighter than before. In one of the newer schools far from Seattle, a young teacher named Elena told her students the story every spring. She stood by a window as rain began to fall, the smell of wet earth rising through the air. There was once a man, she said, who had everything but believed in nothing. And there was a girl who had nothing but believed in everything good. One day their worlds met, and both were never the same. Her students, barely old enough to understand the scale of it, still listened intently. The story always ended with the same line, one that had traveled across generations like a prayer, cold as cold. Kindness is everything. At the end of each tour at the mansion, visitors were given a small card before they left. On one side was a picture of the ballerina. On the other, a quote from Lily's final letter, "If you ever doubt what one small act can do, remember this: I once gave my jacket to a stranger, and it changed both our lives." Most people kept the card, some framed it, others tucked it into wallets or journals as a quiet promise to do better. One winter, on the 50th anniversary of Lily's passing, the foundation hosted a grand celebration in the garden. The mayor of Seattle, philanthropists, former students, and families whose lives had been changed by her work all gathered under a glass canopy glittering with light. The air was cold but joyful. At the center of the stage stood Maya, now gray-haired and wise, holding a small box in her hands. She opened it carefully, revealing the original ballerina, the one Lily had kept for all those years. Its golden arm still gleamed perfectly. Maya lifted it to the microphone and said, "This little figurine is proof that kindness can repair anything: a heart, a life, even the world. It's fragile, yes, but so are we, and maybe that's what makes us precious." The audience rose in applause, tears shining in countless eyes. As the night ended, rain began to fall lightly over the crowd, soft and rhythmic, as if the world itself were blessing the moment. The lights from the mansion reflected on the wet stone path, and in that shimmer, the past seemed to come alive. It was as if William, Grace, and Lily were all there, standing together again, watching the next generation carry their torch. Long after the guests had gone, Mia walked into the library alone. The fire burned low, the lake outside calm under the moonlight. She placed the ballerina back on the table beside the newer one, her hand lingering on their porcelain forms. She looked up at the portraits and smiled. "We're still building doors," she whispered. She turned to leave, but before she stepped through the doorway, she glanced back one last time. The firelight caught the gold in the ballerina's arm, and for just a moment, it seemed to glow brighter, almost alive. The rain outside tapped steadily against the windows, and a breeze moved softly through the room, stirring the pages of the open notebook on the desk. The last words written there, long ago in Lily's careful handwriting, glimmered faintly in the light. "Kindness outlives us." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing over the gardens, the stone paths, and the lake beyond. Each drop rippled outward, joining the next, and the next 1,000 small circles spreading across the water, each one touching another. And in that endless pattern, you could see it, the legacy of a jacket, a child, a billionaire, and a lesson the world would never forget. Because in the end, every act of kindness, no matter how small, becomes a ripple in someone else's life, and those ripples, once set in motion, never truly stop. The film of their lives would end not with words, but with moments, a series of living portraits that played like memories in motion, overlapping time and generations. The scene would open on the same gray Seattle sky that had watched it all begin. Rain fell gently over Lake Washington, the droplets rippling the water like soft applause from heaven. The camera would drift slowly across the surface of the lake, past the swaying reeds, past the reflection of the mansion, glowing like a memory, until it found the great library window, the heart of everything. Through the glass, the fire would flicker, and the two porcelain ballerinas on the table would catch the light, their shadows dancing against the old books behind them. A soft piano melody would rise in the background, slow and warm, the kind that carries both sadness and peace. The camera would cut to a montage of faces, children laughing in classrooms built by the foundation, teachers holding up worn copies of Lily's story, volunteers planting gardens outside a hospital that bore the Hartman name. In a distant village, a little girl would unwrap a winter coat from a donation box, pink, small, almost identical to the one Lily had once worn. She'd slip it on and smile shyly at her mother, who would pull her into an embrace. The world had come full circle. The next shot would move to a sunlit office where Maya, now in her 70s, sat at a large oak desk. Papers were spread before her, proposals for new schools, new programs, new lives to be changed. Behind her hung a photograph of Lily and Grace, their arms around each other, with William's portrait framed just above them. Maya would reach for a small glass dome on her desk and gently dust it off. Inside stood the golden arm ballerina, still flawless after all these years. She'd tap the glass twice, whispering, "We're still building doors," before turning back to her work. The music would swell as the camera drifted again, this time through the streets of Seattle. The Hartman name was everywhere, engraved on library walls, carved into playground benches, etched into the stone of hospitals. But it wasn't just a name, it was an echo, a reminder of what kindness could build. The city itself seemed warmer, softer. A bus driver helping an old woman onto her seat, a teenager holding an umbrella over a stranger's head, a man leaving coffee for someone sleeping rough. None of them knew the whole story, but somehow they were all part of it. Then, as the music quieted, the scene would return to the mansion. The camera would move through the hallways, slowly past the family photographs. The walls lined with paintings of children who had graduated from the Hartman schools. It would pass through the dining room, where the long table was set not with crystal and silver, but with notebooks, pencils, and cups of hot cocoa waiting for the next group of children visiting the foundation. It would pass through the kitchen, where laughter could be heard, staff preparing for the day of giving, the annual celebration that now brought thousands to the estate every year. The final room would be the library again. The air would shimmer with the golden light of sunset. Dust motes would float lazily in the air, turning in the glow like tiny stars. On the armchair, a small blanket would be draped neatly, as though waiting for someone to return. On the side table beside the ballerinas lay the original notebook, its pages weathered, its corners curled from years of touch. The camera would zoom in on a single handwritten line near the end of the final page, "A cold is cold. Kindness is everything." The sound of rain would fade, replaced by the distant laughter of children outside, a new generation playing on the lawn where Lily once ran barefoot as a girl. Their laughter would carry into the room, wrapping around the firelight like a melody of life continuing. The montage would shift once more, flashes of memory layered like watercolor strokes. William sitting by the fire pretending to sleep. Little Lily creeping across the rug, her pink jacket slipping from her shoulders as she draped it over his knees. Grace rushing in, her eyes wide with fear. The ballerina falling, the moment freezing mid-air, then landing gently on the table, its arm chipped but still beautiful. The image would dissolve into Lily's adult face, smiling as she told a crowd of students, "Never underestimate what one small kindness can do." Her words would echo softly as the camera panned across dozens of faces listening to her faces of every color, age, and place, each one carrying her legacy forward. Then the scene would return once more to the lake at night. The rain would have stopped. The water would be still, perfectly mirroring the mansion's lights. A soft breeze would ripple the surface, spreading the reflection outward until the lights shimmered like stars. The camera would tilt upward to the sky, revealing the real stars glimmering above, infinite, connected, eternal. The piano would fade to a single violin note, drawn out like a heartbeat, and then, in a tender cinematic moment, a child's voice, clear and innocent, would narrate the final lines. As if reading from William's old letter, generosity is not about value. It's about heart. I once tested the world, and a little girl taught me that the richest people are those who give. As the words finished, the camera would return to the ballerinas on the table. A faint breeze from the open window would stir the lace curtain, and the light would catch the golden arm, making it gleam one last time before fading into darkness. The screen would go black, and then the final text would appear in white letters, inspired by the true strength of kindness. Underneath, a final line would fade in, dedicated to everyone who chooses compassion in a world that tells them not to. But the story wouldn't really end there. Because stories like this don't end, they ripple. The closing credits would roll over real images of children across the world, students in bright classrooms, families smiling in front of new homes, volunteers carrying boxes of food through floodwaters. Each image would be captioned with the name Hartman Foundation, but in small letters beneath, the words inspired by Lily Miller. The final image would show a girl in a raincoat, pink, bright, and new, standing beside her mother under an umbrella. They'd look up at the mansion on the hill, its windows glowing through the mist. The little girl would wave, not knowing exactly why, but feeling somehow that the house was waving back. As the screen faded out completely, the piano melody would return one last time, slow, gentle, familiar. It would carry the audience back to that very first day, the sound of rain on glass, and the heartbeat of a story that began not with power or wealth, but with a child's simple act of care. Because in the end, that was the truth William Hartman discovered too late, and Lily Miller carried for a lifetime, that kindness doesn't need witnesses or wealth to matter. It just needs to be given freely, fearlessly, again and again. And long after the people who gave it are gone, the light it leaves behind continues to shine, like rain turning to stars over a quiet lake, in a house that kindness built. There are stories the world forgets, stories of kings and empires, of fortunes built and lost, of names that once shone like stars before fading into the noise of history. But every so often, there comes a story that endures, not because it is grand but because it is true. The story of William Hartman and Lily Miller is one of those, a story that began not with destiny or power but with rain, a small housemaid's daughter, and a single act of kindness that rippled farther than anyone could have imagined. If this were the end of a film, the camera would open on the same gray sky where it all began. Rain would fall again, soft and steady, tapping against the window of the mansion that still stood proudly over Lake Washington. But inside, the world would be brighter now. The fire would be burning in the library, the air rich with the scent of cedar and warmth. The armchair would still be there, facing the window, and on the table beside it the two ballerinas, one mended with gold, the other perfect and new. Between them, a framed quote would catch the light, kindness is everything. A narrator's voice, calm, deep and steady, would begin to speak over the imagery. They say time changes everything, the voice would say. But there are things that time cannot touch, like love, courage, and the quiet grace of compassion. The camera would pan slowly through the room, passing the shelves of books William once read, the photographs of Lily and Grace, and the old notebook lying open on the desk. The pages would flutter gently as if turned by an unseen hand, stopping on the first entry, William's own handwriting, trembling but full of purpose. Before you and your mother came into this house, I was a man surrounded by everything and everyone money could buy, but completely alone. The voice would continue. He thought he was testing the world. But the truth is, the world was testing him. And it was a child, the least expected of all, who showed him that the richest thing a person can own is a generous heart. The scene would dissolve into flashbacks, the young Lily draping her jacket over his knees, the ballerina slipping from her hand, the old man's cold eyes softening for the first time in years. Cold is cold, her small voice would echo faintly, a whisper carried through memory, kindness is everything. Then the camera would shift to the city below, where the Hartman Foundation's symbol shone in the windows of hospitals and schools. Children ran across playgrounds with laughter spilling into the air. Doctors treated patients in clinics built in Lily's name. Volunteers carried food, built homes, planted trees, all under the legacy that began with that small, selfless act. The narrator would go on. She grew into a woman who believed that wealth was not measured by what you keep, but by what you give. She built doors where the world built walls, and through those doors she let light in light that still burns today. The music would rise, the same soft piano that played when William first smiled at Lily years ago, now joined by strings that swelled like an open sky. People say her kindness changed a man, the voice would say, but what they forget is that it changed the world too. One heart at a time. The scene would cut to a montage of generations that came after. A young mother reading to her son from a children's book titled The House That Kindness Built. A group of college students volunteering abroad, wearing shirts that bore the Hartman emblem. A man sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, being handed a cup of coffee by a stranger who smiled and said, "Kindness is free." A little boy giving his jacket to a classmate on a snowy morning. The world repeating in quiet ways what that little girl had once done without thinking. Then the voice would grow softer, more intimate. We live in a world that moves fast, that measures worth in numbers and names. But sometimes it only takes one person to remind us what truly matters. For William was Lily, for Lily it was Grace. And for the rest of us, maybe it's whoever teaches us that warmth doesn't come from wealth, but from the heart. The camera would return to the mansion one final time. It would drift through the garden, past the stone path glistening with rain, past the blooming flowers that framed the fountain where the foundation's first ceremony had once taken place. Children's laughter would echo faintly from somewhere nearby. The house itself would seem alive, its windows glowing gold, its door wide open as though still welcoming whoever needed shelter. The narrator's voice would continue, fading almost to a whisper. If you ever find yourself standing in the rain, wondering whether one small act can make a difference, remember this place. Remember the man who doubted kindness and the child who proved it to him. Remember that even the smallest light can guide someone home. The piano would slow, a single note lingering as the camera rose high above the lake. The reflection of the mansion and the water would shimmer, breaking into ripples that spread farther and farther out. The rain would blur the surface until sky and water became one, no beginning, no end. And then, faintly, a child's laugh would echo again, bright, joyful, eternal. The screen would fade to black, and the narrator would speak the final words, "Kindness is the only legacy that never fades. It's the one thing that belongs to everyone, costs nothing, and yet builds empires of the heart. And if you're lucky enough to find it or brave enough to give it, then you've already changed the world." As the credits rolled, the last images would appear, a slow pan of real letters and photographs from people touched by the Hartman Foundation. Smiling children in classrooms, elderly couples holding hands, doctors standing beside new hospital wings, volunteers planting trees in distant villages. Each photo would fade gently into the next, until the final one, a young girl standing in front of the mansion, wearing a pink jacket, holding her mother's hand. Her face would mirror Lily's from decades ago. She'd look up at the rain and stretch out her hand to catch it, laughing as the droplets touched her skin. Then the final words would appear on screen. "Cold is cold, kindness is everything." The music would rise one last time, soft, hopeful, infinite, and fade into the sound of the rain continuing beyond the frame. The credits would finish, and the screen would go dark. But even in that darkness, something would remain, a warmth, a quiet conviction, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the world could still be good. And long after the audience had left, after the lights had come up and the theater was empty, the echo of that story would stay with them, not as fiction, but as a reminder that every act of kindness, no matter how small, begins a chain that never truly ends. Some stories are told once and forgotten, but others, the ones made of love, loss, and redemption, live forever in the hearts of those willing to listen. The story of William Hartman and Lily Miller is one of those. It began with rain, a test, and a child's compassion. And though the people are gone, their lesson endures, as constant as the rain, as bright as the gold in a mended ballerina's arm. Because in the end all stories fade, but kindness always finds its way back. Every story leaves something behind, a trace, a whisper, a question about what it means to live a good life. The story of William Hartman and Lily Miller isn't really about money, fate, or luck. It's about the invisible currency that moves the world when nothing else can, kindness. It begins as something small, a child's instinct to give warmth to someone who looks cold, but what makes it extraordinary is how that act keeps growing long after the moment has passed. The true lesson of their story is that compassion has a reach far greater than we ever imagine, and that a single act of genuine care can rewrite the lives of those who give it and those who receive it. William Hartman was a man who had everything the world told him mattered: power, control, and unimaginable wealth. Yet he lived inside a mansion built of loneliness. Every wall, every polished surface reflected not comfort but emptiness. When he tested his maid and her daughter, he wasn't testing their honesty, he was testing humanity itself. He wanted proof that goodness still existed in a world he believed had long forgotten it. What he didn't understand was that goodness doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly in the form of a child offering her jacket, a mother's trembling apology, or a broken toy placed gently on a table. Lily's act of compassion was pure, not because it was dramatic, but because it was effortless. She didn't think about morality, reward, or consequence. She simply saw someone cold and wanted to help. In that simplicity lies the story's greatest truth, that kindness doesn't come from calculation, but from instinct, from a heart that sees need before judgment. Her gesture became a mirror in which William saw everything he had lost: innocence, faith, warmth. In a single moment, she gave him what decades of wealth could not buy: a reason to believe in people again. The lesson extends far beyond their mansion or their time. It speaks to every generation that mistakes cynicism for wisdom and self-preservation for strength. The world often teaches us to guard ourselves, to measure every exchange in terms of gain. But the story reminds us that the things worth keeping, trust, love, generosity, only grow when shared. When William gave his fortune to Lily, he wasn't rewarding her, he was freeing himself. The empire he built through ambition became meaningful only when filtered through compassion. His true inheritance wasn't money, it was redemption. Grace, too, embodies a quieter lesson. She shows that dignity lives not in status but in integrity. Despite hardship, she never let bitterness poison her heart. Her humility became the soil in which her daughter's kindness grew. Through her we see how goodness is passed not by preaching but by example. Grace didn't tell Lily how to love. She showed her through patience, honesty, and courage. The story honors people like her, those who work in the background, unnoticed, yet carry the world forward with quiet grace. Lily's journey after inheriting William's fortune transforms the story from a personal redemption into a universal testament. She turns power into service, privilege into purpose. She teaches us that kindness isn't a feeling, it's a choice. One that must be renewed daily even when the world makes it difficult. She faced doubt, greed, and exhaustion, yet she kept giving, because she understood something profound: that compassion doesn't drain us. It replenishes us. Each act of generosity plants a seed, and when one person dares to plant it, others begin to follow. At its heart, the story is about mending not just broken toys or fortunes, but broken hearts, broken faith, broken humanity. The golden arm of the ballerina symbolizes this perfectly. It wasn't repaired to hide the damage, it was mended to celebrate it. The Japanese call this kintsugi, the art of filling cracks with gold, making the object more beautiful for having been broken. That is what William became through Lily's compassion, something more human, more complete. It's also what Lily became through his trust. Their lives, once fractured, became stronger at the seams where kindness held them together. The lesson is also a warning. It tells us that without empathy, success becomes isolation. Wealth without compassion turns into emptiness. We live in an age where achievement is measured in numbers, followers, and possessions. Yet William's story shows the futility of all that. You can own the world and still have nothing if your heart has nowhere to belong. True wealth is the impact you leave on others, the warmth you create, the hope you spark, the good you pass forward. Lily's foundation, the schools, the hospitals, the homes, are metaphors for what happens when one person chooses to build doors instead of walls. The empire she inherited wasn't her destiny, it was her responsibility. And she fulfilled it not by expanding it, but by opening it, letting the world in, one soul at a time. Her story reminds us that kindness isn't about changing everyone's. It's about touching the few you can reach, and trusting that the ripples will take care of the rest. What makes this story timeless is its refusal to give up on humanity. It doesn't deny that people fail, deceive, or hurt. It acknowledges darkness but insists that light exists anyway, not in grand gestures or heroes, but in ordinary hearts willing to care when no one is watching. It suggests that redemption isn't found in temples or prayers, but in action, in moments when compassion outweighs fear. When the mansion becomes the house that kindness built, it ceases to be just a place, it becomes a metaphor for what all of us can build within ourselves. We are all architects of our own legacy. Every time we choose understanding over judgment, generosity over greed, warmth over indifference, we lay another brick in that invisible house. The question is not whether we have the resources to be kind, but whether we have the courage. In the end, the story of William and Lily doesn't belong only to them. It belongs to anyone who has ever doubted goodness and then found it in the most unexpected place. It belongs to the tired mother who still finds a way to comfort her child, to the stranger who smiles at someone they'll never see again, to the one who forgives when it would be easier to hate. It tells us that our smallest choices carry infinite echoes, that love, when given freely, survives even when we do not. And so the final lesson is simple yet profound: kindness is not a gift we give the world. It is the bridge that keeps the world standing. It is the language that speaks beyond time, wealth, or difference. William learned it too late. Lily lived it fully, and now it waits for each of us to remember. Because one day, long after our names have faded, the warmth we gave, the jacket we offered, the hand we extended, the forgiveness we chose will remain. It will live in someone else's heart, passed quietly from one soul to another, until it becomes something larger than any one life. That is how kindness works. It doesn't end, it endures. And maybe that's the true miracle of this story, that it started with one act and never stopped moving. Because in the end, as the rain still falls softly over Lake Washington, one truth remains unshakable: cold is cold, and kindness always is everything. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.